I sighed as I saw the toll booth looming up in front of us. My wife and I had driven down this road 1,000 times in the 10 years we'd been married. It was actually the place we took our first date, and we loved to drive down it on Sundays and feel nostalgic. Despite the number of times we've driven the long and winding route, the toll booth always surprises me a little. It sounds weird to say that our first date was a drive, but I think it was honestly pretty sweet. I'm a photographer, have been since I was 19, and I often shoot weddings and family photos for people in the area. I've got an amazing eye for location, and my photos have been featured in not just people's homes, but also in magazines that debut the beauty of North Georgia and the Carolinas. The Appalachians have been my home since I was born, and I know how to bring out her beauty in my photos. I was 22 and on my way to a wedding when I spotted a car on the side of the road with a young woman sitting on the hood. She waved her hands at me, asking if I would stop, and I rolled down my window to see if I could help. She said her car had broken down and was wondering if I could help her out. I'm no mechanic, and my car knowledge stops at changing my oil, so I offered her a ride to the wedding I was attending so she could call a wrecker. She agreed and ended up hanging out with me the whole wedding. The wrecker couldn't get there for 3 or 4 hours, and I was the only person that she knew. So, in between photo shoots, we talked. I got her some food. Weddings usually have a little extra, and this one was more of a country union than a black tie affair. We sat around and chatted as I took some candid shots. We discovered that we actually had a lot in common, and when the wrecker called her, she told him to just drop it off at her mechanic. I drove her home afterwards and invited her to dinner with me later that week. I know what you'll say, it wasn't a real date, but it meant something to us, and we've considered it our first date for years. We even went back on our first anniversary to put a marker where her car had broken down. It may be a little macabre, but we put a wreath there to commemorate her little coupe. It had died on that spot the day we met. We still keep that wreath up. We stop at it sometimes so we can remember how we came to know each other. The spot where her car died is about 2 miles from the toll booth. The toll booth is an oddity. It's just a random toll booth out in the middle of the woods. You put 50 cents in the basket, the booth is never manned, and you head on your way. I have no idea who comes to collect the money. I don't imagine it makes a lot of it, but it's probably some senator's nest egg for when he gets put out of office. We always keep change in the car for just such an occasion, not minding paying a little toll to see the road that started our happy life. Today, however, I couldn't find 50 cents in the cup holder. It's been a busy week. We just put a down payment on our new house, my wife just started a new job, and I had just finished shooting a big wedding that more than paid for the down payment on the new house. But it left us a little light otherwise. We had cashed in our change jar that sat in the cup holder, something to get us by till payday, and I had forgotten to put more change in it afterwards for the toll road. The drive was kind of our date night this weekend. We had a picnic in the back seat, and we were going to go up to the lake where the wedding had been held. The lake was where we had our own wedding, and we went there often to picnic or swim or just enjoy a quiet afternoon together. "What's the matter?" Carol asked. I dug a nickel out from between the seats and weighed the pathetic little pile of change. 5 pennies, 2 dimes, and a nickel were all I had managed to find under the seats. The arm hung stoically across the road, little more than a wooden suggestion than a real barrier. I had thought many times that I could probably just drive through it and be done with the stupid thing, but such things were a little too rebellious for me. "You got any change?" I asked, doubting she did, but wanting to be sure. "No," she said, looking through her purse before exclaiming, "Aha!" and dropping another nickel onto my palm. "Well, that's a little better, but it's not quite 50 cents. Just dig some out of the change cup," she said. I shook the cup at her, reminding that we had recently traded it in. "Oh yeah. Well, what shall we do, my dear?" I considered turning around, maybe just forgetting the whole thing, but a new idea suddenly bubbled to the surface. I pulled onto the soft shoulder of the road, the car protesting as much as my wife. I'm sure my car's wheels were going to bog down any minute. The shoulder of the road is soft turf and seed grass, and I expected my tires would spew up earth and stick. I'd have to sheepishly explain to some highway patrolman how I'd gotten stuck then. To my surprise, though, I drove easily around the barrier. I laughed and wondered why I hadn't simply done this before. "What are you doing?" my wife asked, half laughing but also half aghast. "We've given this thing 50 cents loads of times. I think it can give us a pass, just this once." We both laughed as we drove away from the lonely little toll booth, but I think even then, I felt a slight twinge on the back of my neck. I would remember it later and realize I had been warned. We drove down the familiar road, taking in nature's bounty and chuckling at our daring. The trees were ablaze with early fall oranges and deep, healthy greens. The sky was a perfect robin's egg blue, and I just knew that the lake would be wonderful today. We could watch the sunset, maybe have a little fire before going home, and snuggling in bed at the end of a perfect day. It was a good plan, but someone had a different one, it seemed. As we drove, my wife watched the leaves with interest. My wife is an unofficial leaf looker, though she would never admit it, and our house has many pictures of beautiful foliage. As I drove, the roads winding onward, I saw her lift her head from the car window and squint at the passing colors. We were both getting on in years, no spring chickens now, but the look she was giving the leaves was decidedly prudish. It was like an old maid who simply can't believe Miss Tyler let her daughter out in that skirt. "John, does something seem off about the trees?" she asked, sounding perplexed. I looked at the trees, the oranges and reds and greens looking completely natural to me, and I told her so. It does, but it doesn't. It's like seeing trees on television. They look kind of glossy, recorded even. I don't know how to describe it. They just look a little weird. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was seeing things. It had been a long week, and we had been through some pretty stressful times. It was enough to make anyone a little jangled. She kept watching the trees, but I'd put my eyes back on the road, wanting to be there already. We had driven for about another 30 minutes, though, when I had to slow down. Sitting in the road, white and brown with a glossy oak arm, was the toll booth. I stopped and looked around, thinking somebody might be playing a little joke, but there was no one around. The toll booth looked exactly as it had before. It was simulated wood grain, and the walls were painted a dark brown and creamy white. The arm was simulated oak with a glossy finish. It looked exactly like the toll booth, but it couldn't be. Could it? Maybe they thought they'd put up another one, my wife asked, smiling but clearly confused. I laughed a little at that. They were getting a little greedy out here, weren't they? I pulled around this one too, and I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror as we made our way down the road. My wife was still looking raptly at the trees as we drove past, her attention becoming unhealthy. When she asked me to take a look, I glanced over to see the unusual reds and oranges and greens, but something did look a little off about them. Had they become even more vibrant? The foliage looked artificial, almost neon, and it battered against my eyes as we watched them go past. Okay, there's no way you can tell me that was just my imagination. I didn't answer her. I just wanted to get to the lake so we could have our picnic and all would be normal again. This was weird, yeah, but it was just a strange phenomenon. We would make it to the lake and everything would be okay. When we drove here next weekend, or the weekend after that, everything would be just as it had always been. I edged my speed up a little, wanting to pass the weird technicolor trees and get into the deep woods I knew were coming. We had driven for about another half hour when my brakes screeched against the pavement. I blinked. It just couldn't be. I had been driving these roads for 10 years, and it was always just the one toll booth. My wife seemed startled too, leaning forward to look unbelievingly at the little booth. It looked exactly like the other two, but that was impossible. We had passed it twice, and I was sure there was only one toll booth out here. There would be no reason to think a second one would make any difference. There was so little traffic out here. "What the hell?" my wife asked. And when I pulled around the arm this time, it was a little more aggressively than I meant to. Maybe, she started, pausing a little as she looked nervously at me, maybe we should just pay the toll. I didn't say anything. I had been too mad to even acknowledge the prickle on the back of my neck this time. Stupid, money-grubbing jerks. They hadn't figured they could line their pockets enough with just one toll booth, so they had to have two more. This was unbelievable. I had a sense of humor about the first one, but if they thought they were going to gouge me for another toll, babe, they had another thing coming. I was going to write my congressman, my senator. I'd write the freaking president about this. They couldn't just, John, gouge people like this. What about tourism? What about local beauty spots? What the hell happened to bringing people out so they could... John! I stopped on the brakes and turned to yell, "What?" at my wife as she stared out the window. Normally, she would have chastised me for yelling at her. I don't think I had yelled at her more than a couple of times our whole marriage, but she was too shaken to even take notice. She was looking out the window, staring at the trees with the strange leaves and pointing with a shaky finger. Look, she stuttered, and I turned to see what she was babbling about. The leaves were still eye-destroyingly bright, but this time they were also melting off the trees. Not regular melting either, but like wet paint dripping off an oversaturated object. I could see them dribbling onto the ground, pooling on the grass as the verdant green lawns became spin art. I put my eyes forward, racing the engine, and tried to reach what I knew was ahead as fast as I possibly could. The toll booth came into view again, but I didn't stop this time. What are you doing?" my wife said, getting nervous as I didn't slow down. I gunned the engine, revving to 70 on the straightaway. "Stop it! Stop! Don't do that!" The engine growled as I nudged it up to 80. "John!" my wife screamed, but it was too late. I crashed through the wooden arm and laughed maniacally as the wooden pieces cascaded off the hood and flew to either side. I had made a lot of mistakes that day, but damaging the booth, that was the worst one. My wife screeched when I hit the arm, but one look at me had reduced her to silence. I glanced over at her and immediately felt sorry for what I had done. My foot came off the ignition and the car slowly spun to a stop in the middle of the two-lane road. I had damaged state property. I was sure there was some sort of camera on the booth somewhere, and it would be easy enough to see me ramming the arm. I thought about driving back to the booth and seeing if there was a number I could call to report the accident, but finally I just decided to keep going so we could make it to the lake before dark. As I drove, I realized my wife had been silent the whole time. I turned to tell her I was sorry, to apologize for going a little nuts back there, but she wasn't paying any attention to me at all. She was looking at the countryside as it rolled by. "Honey, I'm sorry about all that. I just let it all get to me. I'm sorry for yelling. Sorry for acting like a psycho. I was just so... The trees are wrong, John." Her voice sounded on the edge of hysteria. "What?" I asked, craning my neck around. "They're all dead. They're all dead, John." I turned right, wanting to see what she was talking about, but when I saw the trees, I wasn't sure why it had taken me so long to see. The trees, so vibrant and colorful before, were now sickly and forlorn. The vibrant colors had oozed right out of them, and the leaves hung limply from the trees as their bark hung pale and peeling. It wasn't just the trees either. The sky looked yellow and sick. It made no sense. What the hell was going on? This was nothing like how the road usually was. It was nothing like how it had looked the first time we'd seen the toll booth. I put my foot down on the ignition and we kept rolling forward towards our destination. It only got weirder the longer we drove. The longer we drove, the more I expected to run into that toll booth again. The longer I drove and didn't encounter that ramshackled booth, the more paranoid I became. The world outside didn't help much either. The sky became darker and darker as we went. The leaves began to drop from the trees in droves. The limbs were skeletal, the bark crumbling from the long, fragile limbs, and the farther we traveled, the more desiccated they became. We should have come to the deep woods by now. We should have come to the lake by now. We should have seen another car, seen a deer, seen something. My wife stopped looking out the window, and I kept sneaking glances at her to make sure she was okay. She just sat hunkered against the seat, rubbing her shoulders as she tried not to notice what was going on outside. I should have been worried about her. I should have stopped to make sure she was okay, but I was feeling on the verge of mental collapse myself. We never made it to our destination, little as I would have wanted to get out if we had. As the sun began to set, I realized how much worse it could get. "Honey," I whispered, not sure how long it had been since we'd spoken. It felt like days, weeks, but my mind railed against this idea. We were just a little lost on a road we had driven so many times we could have set the mile markers. I wasn't sure what was going on here, but I was sure that we would come out of it okay. "We shouldn't have driven around it." "What?" I asked, confused by her answer. "We shouldn't have hurt the toll booth." She turned towards me and she looked afraid. "We should have just paid the toll. Now it's mad, and it might never let us get off this road." "That's nonsense," I said, but it lacked conviction. I had been out here at night before, driving home after a day on the lake, but I had never seen it this dark. The trees no longer looked to be the old pines that I'd come to love. The trees I could see from the headlights looked more like maples, with a thick dark sap running out of them. If I looked too long at them, some of them even seemed to have faces. I always looked away when I noticed this, afraid to meet their gaze, but I could feel them looking at me nonetheless, challenging me to meet their eyes. As much as I wanted to tell her she was wrong, I couldn't argue the fact that we seemed to be stuck, and it had all started after we drove around the toll booth. "Quick, dig under the seat and see if you can find 15 cents. She looked at me in disbelief. "What? 15 cents? That way, if we see the toll booth again, we can pay the toll and get out of here," I nearly growled at her. She moved slowly, like someone in a dream. She began to search under the seats for change, and as she searched, I kept driving. I was beginning to believe that something outside the norm might be at play here, and the further we drove, the more I also believed that we were being followed. The moon hung overhead, the bright yellow moon like a kid's Halloween drawing, and by that popcorn yellow beam, I could see things running through the woods. They loped along like big dogs, their bodies oddly elongated, and their legs thick and long. I never got more than a quick look at them, but that look was enough. I think I see a quarter in the track of the seat, but I can't get it. Can you pull over so I can reach it?" I gritted my teeth, but a quarter would get us there for sure. I pulled over slowly, my lights still glaring into the woods, and told her to please be quick. My wife stepped out, getting down beside the car so she could reach below the seat. I glanced around nervously, watching the woods for signs of the creatures. My wife was saying how she almost had it, but it kept slipping through her fingers. I told her to be quick, and when I looked back at the tree line, I saw one. It was like a mountain lion that had been dipped in tar. It was like a massive cat, with black ridges of overlapping plates. I imagined I could see the headlights reflected off its grinning mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, and its claws clicked impatiently on the edge of the pavement. "Carol," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creatures. "I've almost got it," she growled through gritted teeth. The creature didn't seem to have eyes, but its head turned menacingly towards the car as Carol spoke. As the quarter came free, I reached down and grabbed her by the collar of her t-shirt, lifting her into the car. My wife isn't large, maybe 5 feet, but at that moment it wouldn't have mattered if she'd been a giant. I pulled her back into the car and pushed my foot down on the accelerator as hard as I could, the door bumping shut as we got back on the road. If I had hesitated even a moment longer, we'd likely be dead. As it was, I clipped the beastie in the side of the head instead of full in the side. The chest of the creature would have caved the front of my car in, but its head whipped heavily to the side as it broke one of the headlights. I barely noticed as I flew down the road at 70, the other creatures in hot pursuit. We were doing 90 as we barreled forward, but I could see the pack of nightmare hounds right behind us. The rear lights lit their chitinous faces hellishly, and I took the hairpin turns with wheel-screeching accuracy. I'm no NASCAR driver, but the sight of those creatures behind me was enough to push me onward. If they caught me, we'd both be dead. If I crashed, we'd both be dead anyway. Seemed like either way, our options were pretty limited. They followed us for a long while, too long for creatures their size. I was driving 90 most of the time, but they kept pace as easy as if I'd been going 20. I was keeping ahead of them, but only just. I felt them bump the back bumper more than once. They seemed intent on forcing me off the road, but they couldn't quite hit hard enough to force me off. My wife shuddered every time we got hit, and I found myself barely able to keep it on the road after every successful strike. After some indiscriminate amount of time, I looked in the rearview mirror to find that we were alone again. A few minutes later, I saw the toll booth come up into view, but not the one I was used to seeing. This toll booth was black, the paneling looking like the skin on those creatures, and the arm looked like an unprocessed tree trunk. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the money into the basket, whispering sorry as the arm slid up to permit us. We pulled through the turnstile, and it was like crossing some kind of barrier into another world. My grandmother had grown up in Ireland and had sometimes told me stories about people who crossed the barrier between their world and into the realm of Fae. Grandma always said that people could cross into the fairy realm without realizing it, but I knew all too well when I crossed the border out of whatever place we had been in. It was like passing under the coldest waterfall I could imagine. We got home without incident, but it's the craziest thing. We had voicemails from our friends, a client, and even my wife's new job, asking where we were and why we'd been gone for so long. It seemed that even though we had left just after lunch on Sunday, we didn't return till Tuesday night. The car's still damaged, so I know we didn't imagine it. The car is damn near out of gas, and the oil shows that it's almost due for an oil change, despite having been done less than a month ago. I don't know what the hell happened to us, but I know I'll be keeping money in the cup holder from now on. Whether we ever choose to go down that road again or not, I will always have money to feed the toll booths that may appear in my life. You never know where they might take you if you don't play by the rules. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. Looks like we've once again tripped into that place between places, that place that so many of my stories seem to take place. Maybe one day we'll head there again, and maybe we'll learn a little bit more about it. But until then, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle and Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Xaronana for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributor. And thanks to Glen Jenkins for being our Ghostwriter tier contributor. Thanks, everybody. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I do. And you can get your spooky on a Tuesday and a Thursday. Though I hope that you'll still watch them when they come on YouTube. Your patronage means everything to me. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.